Thank you very much. As the others, I would also like to say thank you for the invitation. I'm grateful that I'm having the opportunity to talk to you. I am a political scientist working on Islam in different regions of the world, mainly in the non-Arab world, with a particular focus on Islam in South Asia, but also its European implications. And in this connection, I was involved in a particular research group that was called Muslims in Europe, and that existed between 2006 and 2010 at the Center for Modern Oriental Studies in Berlin, a research center which primarily focuses on lives and societies in Asia and Africa, with a strong emphasis on Muslim societies. And the reason we came to look at Europe in this connection was that many of the Muslims who have originally come from South Asia, but also from other regions of the Middle East and Africa, they are now having a strong impact in Europe itself. And the question was that we were asking ourselves, what are religious groups of Islam doing in Western Europe seemingly differently as to their countries of origin? And how does that difference relate to norms prevalent in Europe, but not limited to it? And within this group, we had a number of subgroups, a number of sub-projects devoted to particular groups, actors, institutions, showing and exploring the diversity of Muslim lives. In this connection, what was important for us, and what actually is also important for me as a supervisor of PhD projects at the Free University Graduate School of Muslim Cultures and Societies, to reduce the identity of Muslims not only to their religious understanding, because what we see in their lives is that we have to see the concurrent behavior as people affiliated, associated, tied to a particular religion, but also as social beings. And there is a strong connection to their cultures of origin. There's a strong connection to their social lives. And we see that a lot of these groups play out, and a lot of these networks play out as identity politics. In fact, in the current age, at the current time, where we see an upsurge of identity politics, we should be able perhaps to better also understand the drivers and the structures that lead to Muslim groups, networks, practices playing out not just in religious formats, but also in other formats, in cultural formats, in political formats, in social formats, because we are dealing with a situation of migratory and compository background of society where these elements play a strong role. Just to give you a brief idea of what we were looking at that particular research group, which gave us a better understanding of the diversity of Islam in Europe, were the missionary movements of the Tablighi Jamaat and the Dawat-e-Islami, and the Ahmadiyya, the sectarian movement, which is primarily also driven by missionary incentives. Then the gender discourses in the Turkish Islamic organization Milli Görüş, which was briefly mentioned in the beginning in connection with the larger ideological discourses of the Muslim Brotherhood. The same applies to the Islamic Federation in France, which nowadays, since 2017, has been renamed as the Musulmans de France. The Islamic Training Institutes in Germany, and that Interreligiöses Institut für Pädagogik und Didaktik institutions where Muslims offer, and it is very interesting, in particular also women activists offer their own understanding of Islam, how that reconciles with society, how that reconciles with social lives. We are talking about Muslim schools in Britain, the Netherlands, which were then compared with Muslim schools in South Africa. The ways in which they operate and in which they ascertain themselves in Europe show overall a great diversity. And we have come to understand that the distinctions between the way and the level to what they integrate in society are not necessarily and not always depending on the particular orientation in Islam, but are very often dependent on the society in which they operate. For instance, to give an example about the groups mentioned as connected with the Muslim Brotherhood, but also with Salafi organizations, there's much more evidence of tension and conflict, for instance, in the context of France than, let's say, in the context of Britain. And political scientists taking a look somewhat from outside argue that for that is also responsible the way the particular society, the particular social and political setup deals with these diversities. For instance, in Britain, we see that Muslim institutions, Muslim schools are partly or fully integrated into state and public sponsored systems where they are also checked and controlled while at the same time getting funding and support, where, for instance, religious schools, madrasas are included in the public education system in Britain to the extent where they offer particular degrees or sub-degrees, whereas in France, for instance, we see that this integration has been very difficult or not been possible or partly confrontational, which again political scientists and analysts argue has also to do with the understanding of society and of secularism. There is, for instance, a deep distinction between the way the term secularism itself is interpreted. In France, the laïcité concept is very much based on us versus them, which means it's a sort of a segregation, even a separation to a large extent, meaning to say laïcité it means definitely non-religious, whereas secularism in the British context, and more so in some society, let's say, that have been under British colonial rule, for instance in India, secularism can go to the point and to the extent where it is inclusive of everyone, where even in India, for instance, under Gandhi and Nehru, secularism was conceptualized to pointedly include mutual tolerance of different religions, of different beliefs, and of different concepts of society. And this shows itself also in the way how these Muslim groups and institutions operate in Europe, that there are quite a lot of differences in the way they operate in different parts of Europe for the same organization, if only dependent on the context in which they operate. For instance, here we see the European Centre of the Tabligh Jamaat, the missionary movement in Britain, which operates, so to say, quite freely and independently and self-understood. And and there is a madrasa in Britain, in Holcombe, which is connected with the orientation of this particular missionary movement. But then when we come to France, we see quite diverse social, how to say, imprints on their mode of operation. For instance, their center in Paris is, in a sense, confined to a suburb in Saint-Denis, where primarily Muslims of direct migrant origin go, and to the point and to the extent where that particular madrasa is even afraid or scared of putting a signboard outside the building that it is here a mosque which is operating. Here you see the followers, how they also entered the mosque, preparing the mosque, where in contrast, in Marseille, you have a different social profile of Muslim migration, where you have sub-societies of traders, of people who are established, leading their own life, and where they even have managed to establish contact with local politics to build their own mosque and collect the money from the local society. So a very different social profile, both connected with politics, connecting with local traders, and being also accepted and respected, and not being shy also to put the plate outside what they actually are and what they actually are doing. And that's particularly important because it also shows the differences in what way Islam or Muslims can be political. Political in the European context means, in the sense, it starts at the level of local society with civic engagement, meaning to say reaching out into the public, reaching out into society, understanding your community as part of the society. That's why it is very important for a lot of Muslim communities in Europe to offer also social services to community members, where interestingly enough, increasingly, and again depending on the country about which we are talking, a growing number of women are offering services, not on the level of imam, but on other levels in terms of teaching students, in terms of teaching kids, in terms of running particular administrative services for the mosque community, etc. So that, as in many Muslim families, which one knows from Muslim countries, despite the very still strongly operating patriarchal system, it is very often women in the background taking the decisions. And that is, again, being also felt and making more visible in the European context. So the Muslims who arrived in Europe, they were arriving in different ways and for different reasons. We are not even talking today about, so to say, and regions which are often ignored when we are talking about Islam in Europe, historical parts of Europe, in Bosnia, in Russia, etc., who have been here for a very long time and have been here historically present. We are also not even talking about the historical traditions that have been almost forgotten when on today's territory of Spain a Muslim rule was existing, and when around the 10th century, 11th century, Arabic was an intellectual lingua franca also for philosophy and for politics, and where Muslim intellectuals, in a sense, saved the heritage of Greek language knowledge and books which were translated into Arabic. So we are talking about a time period when Muslims came here with primarily migrational trends, which is, that one has to remember, only one of several ways in which Europe was and is connected with Islam. There is an element which is from the religious background important, that is, so to say, their existence as a minority community or which follows a particular system of rules, the fiqh al-aqaliyat, which has a particular meaning. Why it means, and in spite of other political and ideological utterings of Al-Qaradawi, he is also responsible for this minority law regime being prominent and largely accepted also by conservative Muslims in Europe. That is, that you have to submit yourself to the rule of the country. And that is the basic rule, which is directly derived also from Quran. And it is important transformation, as far as people from Islamic studies argue, that this has been over the years, the last 20, 30 years, been very much formalized and has been accepted and structured in a way it was not done before. So there is definitely also a change and a transformation for people who believe that they would and can act as believers and reconcile this identity with European identity. What is also important and often ignored in the European context is that Islam, in effect, in its inner religious debates, offers a lot of reasons and arguments for doing so. Why? Because as compared to the other Abrahamic religions, but also as compared to other world religions, Islam had a particular element of distinction, and that is its founder was also a head of government. And there is a particular document of governance, the Constitution of Medina, which is perhaps the only secular document we know done or made or authored by the founder of a particular religion, where directly elements are negotiated of governance, of living with other parts of society, including with the Jews. Because we should not forget that the current controversy, which is ideologically very much loaded with Israel, is, historically speaking, a very new, very recent phenomenon of, so to speak, modernity, because before the 18th century, there was primarily a lot of cooperation and even cultural overlap between these systems. So these minority living conditions from a religious perspective required religious authority, as they argue, so to speak, what is right and wrong for a Muslim to do in the European context, and that has been increasingly regulated. And at the same time, we should not forget that Islam and Islam in Europe as well has a lot of diversity from a sectarian perspective. For instance, all major sectarian orientations are represented: the Sunni, the Shia, the Salafi, the heterodox sects of the Ahmadiyya and the Alawi. The Sunni, for instance, they are based, as we know, on the 4 law schools and the principles as enshrined in the Quran and the prophetic tradition. Not to forget the practice-based Sufi in themselves, revering prominent clerics, holy men as sheikhs. Here, for instance, while the media and politics very often focus on particular Salafi or modernist or Islamist elements of expression, we did not notice or tend to forget that even Sunni perspectives have found a lot of practice and followers. For instance, I'm giving here the example of a particular Sufi shrine in Birmingham, where there was a burial of Sufi Muhammad Abdullah Khan, who came to Britain to help organize Muslims worship among thousands of new arrivals from the South Asian subcontinent. And in the corner you see his grave. I mean, you see the mass following, and it is a competition and at the same time a different way of culture practicing daily life in that connection. About the Muslim Brotherhood, we have already heard from the political and the ideological perspective. I mentioned that there is a reason why Islam in politics has found a lot of arguments. One reason was, as I mentioned, the original traits of governance, and that in the Quran itself, a large number of principles are directly referring to administrative issues, how to deal with particular issues in a particular context. The other is, of course, the appearance of modernity and nationalism, where in countries which by colonial powers had been occupied and where nationalism could not easily grow as an identity reference, because many of the colonies actually captured different ethnic communities, different language communities. So it was not easy to develop a single nationalist reference, as was the case in Europe under the French, the Spanish, the German linguistic dominance, even though that was also not a given, because all language areas were covering more than one country. But this was more so the case in the colonial regions, and therefore the religious references served as nationalist propellers and identity propellers for many communities. And that not only applied to Islam. In the subcontinent, for instance, in South Asia, we see the same applied to Hindu nationalism, which did not exist before. And now we have a government in India which is operating in its name. It also applied to the Sikh community self-understanding. But even Buddhism, in the sense as it later inspired other regions and other governments, primarily came into a political focus during this period of anti-colonial identity politics. So we have heard about the different aspects of the Muslim Brotherhood, what researchers emphasize, and I just wanted to also share that here, is that they argue it should not necessarily and easily be summarized under one headline, because there is a lot of differentiation in the system, as in any of the other groups and systems in Islam. For instance, that the original groups are primarily focused on the Mashriq, that is the eastern part of the Middle East, where the original movements were operating, whereas the strongest base in Europe, the directest base, is in France, and those organizations, their primary focus of supporters is in the Maghreb, in the western parts of the North African states. We have a similar diversity of Salafis. It is not easy to summarize them under just one headline. The Salafi groups and mosques of younger people in Europe are often attracting young people who want to distinguish themselves from the cultural traits of Islam of their parents, which is not the same as the culture and rules of the Wahhabis in Saudi Arabia, which again is not the same as another Salafi system, the Al-Hadith, which rejects all law schools and wants to return to the very original principles of the Quran without any interference of the law schools. So again, we have already three different elements, and they all call themselves Salafi, and it is very important in our perspective to make such distinctions to not come to different conclusions. So I think the time limit does not allow to go too much into the details of these differentiations here, but just to end more or less on this, how they adapted to the European structures of society. So they approached Europe through a legal framework, they operated through the media, they interacted with the welfare state and social reality, and also with competitive politics. A similar dynamics developed in connection with European values, where we have different levels, different elements of engagement depending on the country and on the subject. So what I wanted to conclude it here with is there was a summarization of the influence that Europe could have by and relevance for religious plurality is that lies in the Western legal tradition legalizing religious plurality, that modernization is a coexistence between theological and secular underpinnings of society, and that secularization could also be a separation of state and religion, which in itself provides space for religious social activism. Leaving it on that, to discuss the variety, you're welcome to ask your questions. Thank you. Because different governments in Europe take different perspectives. Even in Germany, the one president said Islam is part of Europe. The other said Muslims are, Islam is not, which is the expression of a particular ideological and political perspective. What I said is that Islam and Europe has a threefold history, and all the elements are there, and we are dealing with all the elements. I mean, we have been dealing with the element in Bosnia, the issue in Chechnya is there, the question is there how Islam is, the integration is happening in France. So even if for political and ideological reasons politicians refuse to accept the interconnection between Islam and Europe, nevertheless they are forced to deal with it. And increasingly, fortunately, young Muslim activists are becoming part of this interpretation and are becoming part of this engagement. In Germany, you are finding now young Muslim politicians in the Green Party, in the Left Party, in the CDU, in every party they are. And there are also migrants who are supporting the AfD for ideological and political reasons, because identity politics cut across European societies and across the European states. Therefore, the interaction between Muslims and politics is now happening on all ideological and political levels. I hope that this is not a source of conflict, but an inspiration of transformation, because we could see, let's put it that way, the positive effect of this slow transformation also in Germany itself. You know that there is a status for the state dealing with Christian communities based on particular treaties in the early century. Then we know that in Austria there had been a separate treaty with the Muslim community at large. Now Germany understood and has started to develop a treaty framework on state levels. Several states in Germany have already concluded agreements. Currently, they are, as far as I understand, being put on hold because of the tension with Turkey primarily. But again, this tension with Turkey is another complicated issue, because Germany itself was a partner to this tension, who gave to Turkey the right to monopolized the position of imams. It was Germany. And that's why we see that this transformation process is slow, but it continues. And it currently, what I can see, is slightly shifting, which is not bad at all, to a higher level of visibility of young Muslim activists and politicians in all the political parties.
We are speaking today about political Islam and Europe. According to the definition of the Council of Europe, Russia is also part of Europe. I will later speak mainly on the European Union. But you have experience from Russia. What could you say about that? I think there is a very large number of Muslims in Russia. It was a much bigger number as long as it was Soviet Union, of course. But even now, what could you say about the relations there?
I mean, you had in Russia and in the whole post-Soviet states the state muftiyat system, and it is often reduced to a Soviet or Stalinist intervention. The reality is much more complicated. These muftiyats existed even before communism came to power under the Tsar. So there is another, political tradition continuity. Then under Stalinism there was an up and down. There was a ban, and then suddenly there was a reversal of the ban in the Second World War when Muslims were sought after as allies. But the structure continued, and in a sense, this structure is today also trying to ease tensions. And Russia is facing similar challenges as the rest of Europe in terms of migration, because there is a huge number of working migrants of Muslim origin in Russia.
Coming from Central Asia.
Tajikistan, where I was during my research, and I saw it from the other perspective, it is half of their product of the economy is coming from these migrants, 50%. So it is an existential issue for them. So so Russia is limited in its options to either confront it or not. But in a sense, one could argue the muftiyat system helps to regulate these issues, even though it does not prevent the existence of very similar differentiations as in the rest of the world and in other parts of Europe, with the exception of Chechnya, where a particular power, war, corruption kind of configuration developed that was put down by force.
And what is muftiyat?
Muftiyat means it's a state administration which is regulating the mosques and the religious seminaries. It's in a sense similar as in Turkey. But
somehow in close connection to Moscow.
No, that's not that easy. It's more complicated. I mean, they have a certain level. After the Soviet system ended, they gained a certain level of independence. At the same time, it is clear that their representatives cannot operate without talking or coordinating with the state, the KGB follow-up institutions, or any of the other institutions. But on a daily level, on a local level, they have gained a certain level of independence administratively. I think there is no single answer to that, because we see both trends. For instance, in Berlin, we have this very radical project of the Ibn Rushd Mosque, which is run by women who are publicly operating as imams. And in a sense, I would compare it to trends of activism that are international. In a sense, it is somehow nowadays connecting to, as Black Lives Matter, so women lives matter, Muslim lives matter. I mean, these sort of claims for dealing with injustices of society have become globalized, and therefore particular projects in one country will find imitations in another country, and so do the opposite trends as well. We see a global proliferation also of the right-wing populists, and the digital media, as we all know, help in both sides and directions. Tajikistan primarily, I mean, from the poorer, I'm speaking about the post-Soviet space. The poorer the former post-Soviet state in its own economy is, the higher, so to speak, in economic political terms, is the migration. The countries which are economically better off, like Kazakhstan, with their own income from oil exploration, is much less. Kyrgyzstan is somewhere in the middle. Turkmenistan has the advantage of a lot of income also from gas. So Tajikistan is definitely one crucial source of migration, but I think Uzbekistan is also quite strongly represented. I think since we are talking about cultural diplomacy, diplomacy is about talking to the adversary, isn't it? Mm-hmm. So, I mean, if we are deciding to make treaties, I mean, the objective is to implicate, to have participation, to have exchange, to have commitments, so that also the important standard remains, that is observing and following the laws and rules of the land. And a formal treaty, a formal engagement with Muslim communities is another, so to say, stepstone for formalizing such arrangements, for also creating commitments and turning them into a binding force beyond a social or a cultural commitment, accepting, so to say, the guest status and honoring the guest country, formalizing it into legal formats. And then therefore I think it is important to do so. It is important to keep them transparent and to keep the whole process transparent, so to engage people in this process.
Okay. Thank you very much. I think time is passing. We have to break there. Thank you so much.
I would like to ask you, you are giving a presentation here, just like a question, very quick question, about the Muslim Brotherhood. They are using Islam as a tool to show that, to market themselves that they are representing Islam, which is, you know, we have in Islam different sects, different even ideologies, or different adoption to the ideas of Muslim. But Muslim Brotherhood, they represent, or they market themselves as they are representing the entire Islam. It's very dangerous. Some people, they think. So what do you think about how to combat such like marketing? How to combat such marketing for Muslim Brotherhood?
Well, as I tried to say also in my presentation, I think it is, from an analytical point of view, not easy to reduce the Muslim Brotherhood to just one entity. So I think one has to distinguish between different organizations and between certain conceptual approaches. I think the conceptual approaches, one has to make clear what one stands for and what one is against. Principles like what in Europe we call the rule of law and the demands or expectations of society. And I think it is much more useful to achieve clarification on these rules on which people want to live, and then measure the different organizations that come up against such rules. Because reducing them on one denominator will actually only help the extremists. So it is much more reliable to formulate policies and concepts which one wants to defend.
European decision makers, they have to take kind of procedures to combat such, or they are a little bit flexible toward this expansion of their power in Europe?
I think that's precisely the reason why I said so, because Europe, the distinction of Europe and the character of Europe is precisely that we are sharing particular rules of life and particular rules of society. And I think the best way to go against extremist tendencies is to defend these rules. And therefore it is depending on the politicians, on political parties, on civil society activists to become active in defending those rules and to make clear that certain or particular types of behavior are unacceptable, and we are preferring, or we want to defend our life according to the rules that Europe is living on. I think that is the preferable way where Europe can defend its principles rather than going against particular names, denominators, or particular organizations. As you said yourself, they can also change their identity, they can change their nature, they can change their character. So what we can really defend is the way we live in Europe. That is what we can defend.
Thank you. Thank you.
I used to be a Swedish diplomat for many, many years, ambassador since the 1990s, and serving inter alia in Moscow, Beijing, Geneva, Rome, and also in Spain. But I left foreign service after some 10 years as ambassador and started a project together with some senior Europeans called the European Cultural Parliament. It is not a real parliament, it's a voluntary organization which gives a platform and a network for excellent artists, musicians, philosophers, historians, and others in the field of arts and culture to discuss Europe, to try to see various aspects and dimensions of our European continent in a broad sense, but of course with a certain focus on the European Union. The only reason why I feel prepared to discuss in this among these very distinguished speakers that we have had here is that we have in this European Cultural Parliament, we have been dealing a lot with what we call European values, or we sometimes even call it a European soul. I wrote a book 5 years ago which I called La Candide, in the search of a European soul. It wasn't Swedish, I'm afraid, so I can't recommend it directly to those who not do speak Swedish. But there is also a sister organization of our European Cultural Parliament here in Berlin, which is called A Soul for Europe. So there are efforts, not least on the German basis here, trying to see what do we have in common in Europe. It is not only, of course, it's a peace project. The European Union is a peace project, and it's not also only about economy and the substance, but it's also there is something values, perhaps common history, etc., and all these things as background. And then on top of this, very recently I finished a manuscript which will come as a book perhaps in next spring, about what happened around the year 1980, 1979, 1980, 1981. And I will come to that because it's a crucial period. We always speak about the fall of the Berlin Wall, but 10 years earlier, some things even more important happened. So, before that, the role of religion in Europe between the turn of the century and up to 1980, you could say. I would say, generally speaking, God, whatever God we speak about, whatever religion, God is losing ground. not only that, in France, the law of laïcité comes in 1905, which was somehow, of course, in the spirit of the French Revolution more than 100 years earlier. And not only the Russian Revolution 1917, which, of course, somehow was a very hard blow against the Orthodox Church. They did not play the main role anymore, and as the Dr. Reetz was saying, it was ups and downs for religion in Russia. Of course, the two dictatorships, Nazism and Fascism, they were also basically secular, although somehow they could instrumentalize religion for their own purposes every now and then. And interesting enough, the Scandinavian welfare society was also very much contributed to this secular trend. Because the politicians and general people would understand that perhaps poverty is not a punishment of God. Perhaps it is something very social and very concrete. And if we work against it, if we make reforms, if we succeed in making more equality among people, well, it doesn't seem that we need this kind of consolation anymore. You know, this world is terrible, perhaps the next life will be better. We don't need that anymore. We'll try to make this life better. And that is certainly one very decisive point in in a kind of a secular development. The Stalin takeover in Eastern Europe in 1948 is another, because all of a sudden all the Eastern European states, the Baltic states were already Soviet, but from Poland and down south became part of this communist system where religion was not really decided. The post-Second World War, the general improvement of living standard in Europe, not only Scandinavia, but the whole of Europe, had a very strong evolution of living standards, which also led to a secularization. Even in a Germany which was governed by a Christian democratic union, even here, the secularization went on rather speedily. And then, of course, the 1968 movement and the peace movements, and all these movements in the 1970s, and John Lennon's Imagine, you remember, imagine nothing to kill or die for, or no religion. That is some very central phrases in John Lennon's Imagine, and for a kind of a leitmotif for the 70s. Muslim countries in the Cold War time, that means from the late 40s and up till early 90s. You also find that after gaining their independence from, for instance, United Kingdom, France, Netherlands, many of these countries were automatically, almost, because this was the zeitgeist of the time, they were dragged into the Cold War. They had to take side, and Washington and Moscow tried to convince them to be on our side, so to say. Examples were both Iraq and Syria, and they had these strong Baath parties, a kind of socialist parties, and definitely they were leaning on the Soviet side, the Soviet sphere of interest, as Kremlin would put it. Which also you could see, for instance, I happened to spend some time in Moscow in the 1970s, and you could see that many of the universities in Moscow were full of students from both Middle East and from Africa, as a kind of ongoing cultural diplomacy with a very clear agenda. Now, Egypt is a very good example also. Nasser, who was the first after independence, the first leader, he joined the east side. He was rather on the Moscow side in the Cold War. But when he left, when he died, it's around 1970, and Sadat comes, he leans to the west. And of course, in 1981, that is one of the many things that happened in these crucial years, Sadat was killed by a representative of the Muslim Brotherhood. And the Soviet allies, wherever they were in the world, they always tried to play down the role of religion. Perhaps not always by conviction, but they always paid lip service to socialism. Even the non-aligned movement, we shouldn't forget that, because that was, of course, very important. You know, these were big names like Nehru in India, like Tito in Yugoslavia, Sukarno, and Nkrumah in Ghana, etc. Very broad movement. But religion, or a common religion, because they represented very different religions. So secularism as an idea was also part of the non-aligned movement, which was standing sort of in between the East Bloc and the West Bloc, but they also represented rather the secular movement. In Indonesia, a country with the world's biggest Muslim population, Sukarno, during the 60s, particularly took a strong side on Moscow and had a rather strong communist party in Indonesia. And he was, in taking this policy, he was opposed not only by his generals but also by religious leaders. When Suharto came in the 70s, he more and more clearly took the other side. Not only did he rather orient himself to the West, but he also started more and more in the 80s to underline the role of Islam for Indonesia. Afghanistan is, of course, the most striking example of Cold War priorities, and perhaps also the most absurd, because after all, in the Cold War, main priority was to oppose the other side, so East against West in whatever issue, and this meant that the political decision, which was taken at the Politburo in Moscow in December 1979, it had only one very clear goal. Well, it had two. One was to support the ongoing process in Afghanistan right now, where a, let's say, communist inclined, not fully communist, but they certainly had communist sympathies, and they were trying to achieve gender equality, girls in schools, etc. So they wanted to support that development, which was just then going on in Afghanistan. But the main goal for the Politburo was to prevent that the United States would somehow benefit from a situation where the Afghans would ask for help somehow. So the Russians decided then to be one step ahead and to go in, and so many wars are starting by saying, we will, including the First and Second World War, by the way, we will go in here and we will settle this in a fortnight or two. well, as you all know, it took another 8 or 9 years before it was over. So they got stuck there, and this was also, of course, contributed very much to weakening the Soviet Union. But the interesting thing is that the strong support in the Mujahideen movement against Russia came from the United States. There are even famous films about the senator, I think his name was Wilson or so, yeah, who convinced the Congress to make very strong commitment and to arm the Mujahideen resistance with very strong armed deliverers. So the supporters of Mujahideen at that time, United States, they have been kind of paying the price for that 20 years later until a few weeks ago. Now, these years, 79, 81, is the turning point. In January, February 1971, Ayatollah Khomeini takes power in Iran. And very soon, an Islamic State is born. He takes radical measures against women, education of girls, and the whole Western cultural orientation of the Shah, even against the land reform of the Shah, which people in Europe, for instance, found rather progressive after all. But the mullahs thought that would be now the farms will be taken over by Jews and Western capitalists. So they did not support that either. Interesting and rather tragic from a European point of view is that the great Foucault, the leading postmodernist, he kind of idolized Khomeini. He made interviews and reportages and so on during his Paris exile, and he was on the plane from Paris to Tehran in January 79. So it contributed probably to, at the first few years, a very, very positive image of Khomeini. So this is the birth of political Islam in modern times, I would say. The fact that more or less at the same time Sadat is killed by Muslim Brothers also indicates that it is now a kind of revival for radical thinking and political thinking in this religion. But now comes the interesting, it looks historically as a coincidence, and it is of course a coincidence, but it comes exactly at the same time. The Vatican has a Polish Pope for the first time. He came in 79 also. And one of his first trips to his home country, to Poland, and he gathers millions of people for his big mass open door preaches. And his presence there and the reception of his messages becomes a signal for the whole of Eastern Europe. And automatically, the Christian religion, particularly the Catholic religion, becomes a platform for anti-communist change. So this is a kind of a wake-up call for the East Europeans based on religion. And again, a coincidence. Mr. Chapman, you probably forgot the name, but he was the guy who shot John Lennon in December 1980. And he was an evangelicalist. Yeah. He had been a fan of the Beatles, but he then found that Lennon and company, they are sinners, they are not believing in God, and so on. And the evangelicals, as you certainly know, became the very strong platform for Ronald Reagan, just as they were for Donald Trump in 2016, and still. So three parallel, very radical changes in the role of religion. It's not only that, because these years we see the beginning of globalization. Margaret Thatcher takes the initiative. Ronald Reagan takes initiative to free the markets, the movement of goods, services, capital, and people. And another coincidence: China opens the market completely for foreign investments, for foreign capital, and so on. And everything is happening now. So the word, quite frankly, you wouldn't believe it, but in the early 1970s, the word globalization did not exist in the Encyclopedia Britannica. From 1980, it is a word which is worth talking about, because it really has a very strong, and we know what it has meant up till now. Also in terms, of course, it's also the beginning of again opening the gap between rich and poor, because we had been closing this gap for around 70 or 8 years up till 1980. So this is the years of the Renaissance of religions, or as Jürgen Habermas, the German philosopher, said, the post-secular era begins. And it's also the beginning of the end of communism, because now, in a few years now, they cannot resist the strong market forces. They had inconvertible currencies. And an inconvertible currency does not have a chance in a globalized market where all capital and trade is open. And they could also not resist the religious renaissance in Eastern Europe. On top of this, you have Yugoslavia. Tito dies in 1980. And just a few years, his heirs, so to say, they were prepared, and they even had negotiations, very far-going negotiations with Brussels. They wanted to join the European integration project, but the Yugoslavia is starting to fractionate. We have Orthodox movements, we have Catholic movements, and we have Muslim identities. All these identities are taking over, and the rest is history. In the 90s, they were fighting each other. So, also with this Renaissance, we find Islamist tendencies in the 1980s. A radicalization is coming more and more. Of course, the Iran-Iraq war is not only Shias against Sunnis, it is also somehow political Islam, the Iran model, against the half-secular, half-socialist dictator in Iraq, Saddam Hussein. So, and during this war, this also starts a big flow, a very important flow of refugees to Europe, where I would say, very roughly say, that Iranians were mainly secular, fleeing Khomeini, Iraqis mainly more religious. And we have, particularly in my country, Sweden, we have, they constitute a very large part of our immigration community. So the Soviet-Afghanistan war also contributed, both with radicalization of young people. A war always contributes to radicalization, and to more refugees to Europe. So, and on top of this, the Israel-Palestinian permanent conflict became also radicalized because Hamas was born. It didn't exist before the mid-80s. So radicalization all over. Now, let's have a brief look at the consequences up till today, where we are standing now, regarding religious differences in Eastern and Western Europe. I use here as source the Pew Research Center in Washington. And it's clear that in Eastern Europe, including Russia, as a matter of fact, but excluding Czech Republic for interesting reasons, perhaps Kafka, perhaps Franz Werfel, I don't know. They don't have such a strong religious tradition in the Czech Republic. In Slovakia, yes, but in Czech, no. The religion has remained very strong, 75 to 97% actively Christian. That is quite a high proportion. And of course in Russia we know that overnight, more or less, both Yeltsin and Putin, they left communism and they went to church. That is what happened there too. In Western Europe, however, except Greece, perhaps Cyprus, to perhaps also Malta to some extent. But the secular development has continued and continued. There is a low interest in religion. So even in the Christian democratically ruled Germany, only 24% go to church at least once a month. And Sweden, Denmark, and Norway, we are below 10%. France, some predecessors here have mentioned them already. They are, of course, the secular champions or champions of laicite. I think it's a very interesting distinction that was made here between laicite and secularism. But anyway, they had this law already, and they also remain the kind of the champion, the defender of la liberté de blasphémie. You could see every president, from Mitterrand on up to Macron now, is always defending that right, on defending journals like Charlie Hebdo, for instance. And of course, these attitudes are leading to more or less permanent conflicts with the Muslim community. So here are really challenges for some sort of cultural diplomacy. And of course, for people, at least people my generation, but I know that also my children are also fans of Monty Python. They are, of course, on the screen, the champions. With Life of Brian, for instance, came out, I think, 1979, was, of course, terribly criticized by the Vatican and by many other Christian organizations. But these, people like John Cleese and others say, no, I couldn't do this film anymore, or I couldn't do this type of thing, because the atmosphere is that this is just, they did this just before the renaissance of religion, and since then it has become too sensitive. Germany. I mentioned a few times already this day, the strong Muslim presence, 7 million, something like that. But here, much less aggressive against Islamist tendencies in Germany than in France. There is, of course, anti-terrorist measures, new laws, etc. But they are careful, very cautious in religious matters. They have recently taken decision that about the German-financed imam training in German language. That's a way to resist the foreign or perhaps even Islamist-financed mosques and Islamic schools in Germany. But you always, when speaking about Germany, I wrote another book about Germany and the German. The guilt-carrying masters. I'm a great admirer of all the German masters, but they always the problem of guilt from the Second World War, from the Nazi time, is always present in Germany, even today, which means that they are particularly sensitive about anything which looks like racism, like anti-Semitism, or even Islamophobia. So they are not prepared to discuss these things officially in terms of terrorism being a result of a certain religion or culture and so. So all parties except AfD, which had of course its roots in Pegida, patriotische Europäer gegen Islamisierung des Abendlands. Yeah. So that was the only outspoken criticism with a religious content, so to say, or anti-religious content. But you know, AfD had only 10% again in the Bundestag. So it's a rather strong position of the rest of the parties in Germany to be careful about the religions. We have a very strong Turkish community also here, and the Turks were the first Gastarbeiter in Germany. You know, it's 60 years or more ago, or around 60 years ago. And they, of course, they were very welcome, and they were are respected by Germans. Their second generation, however, can sometimes then constitute the kind of problems we are discussing today. And another problem, of course, first or second or third generation, was that 67% of Turkish people in Germany with voting right in Turkey voted in favor of Erdogan's reform, although everybody knew that he had broken all laws of human rights, etc., etc., and has a world record of university professors and journalists in jail. So there is a gap here somehow between, let's say, the knowledge of German intellectuals about the situation in Turkey and the kind of perception that many Turks seem to have. And on top of this, of course, in order to somehow save Europe from the enormous invasion of refugees from the Middle East, the EU took the initiative to contact Erdogan, and Merkel herself was the one who struck the deal. That was, of course, you know, with billions of people in support to Turkey, so that the refugees would stay in Turkey. And that deal also plays a role here. Now, I'll give you the Sweden case as well here, because it's rather interesting in this context. We, of course, still have a lot of traditions and rituals and holidays and so on, which are Protestant-based. And as a matter of fact, up till the end of last century, we had a state church. Although, and you know, and people still get baptized there, married there, and buried there. So it is, they still play a role, but most Swedes are not interested in religion. They are agnostics or atheists, or simply don't care. And then you have to imagine the arrival of about 1 million Muslims in Sweden in the last 20 years. That is quite a challenge for a society. It was on the way already with previous Italian and Greek Gastarbeiter, but here in the last 20 years it was a very strong immigration. All of a sudden Sweden was a multicultural country, and this was welcomed by most people. It was not only exotic, it was charming. It had a good positive effect on gastronomy and so on, and not least in our football teams and so on. So many, a majority, have a positive and a curious, I say almost envious attitude to these religious newcomers. It looks nice to have something to believe in beyond the everyday life and beyond politics and so on. So they may also remember some nice grandma going to church and so on. So that is a kind of attitude, a kind of innocent attitude that you might find among many Swedish citizens. But others, and okay, they are in a minority, but they felt provoked and took a very negative stand. So that is when Swedish Islamophobia might have been born. The Sweden Democratic Party came into parliament in 2010 and today has about 20% supporters in the polls. So that is quite radical. And at the same, we also have radicalization in many suburbs, a little bit like outside Paris. We had a terror attack, by the way, carried out by a guy from Chechnya in 2015. And there has been a significant recruitment to the Islamic State, about 300 Swedes. I think Germany has about 900. So comparatively, Germany has 8 times more people than Sweden has. So it's quite significant. And the situation has escalated in the last few years because integration programs have been poor. Ghettos have come up, parallel societies, clan fights, a lot of shooting and so on. But not so much except for those 300 who are recruited to Islamic State. Political Islam is not so strong as far as I can judge, but we rather have mafia-like showdowns between various groups and clans. Some people say this is a typical example of clash of civilizations. Yes and no, but this is a topic for discussion. Anyway, this situation, this rather radical, dramatic situation, might even lead to a shift of government 2022. I always say that the present and outgoing, because he will leave irrespective of the election next year, Stefan Löfven, he is a little bit of a Swedish Angela Merkel copy. So always when Angela Merkel says something here in Berlin, the week after he will say more or less the same thing. This was, for instance, wir schaffen das, the famous expression there, we can fix it, we can take them and so on. Löfven said the same. And then Merkel says in, I think, end November 15, she said, no, we have to stop, we can't do it. And then Löfven says the same thing. In very many issues, they are similar, they are very close. So and now even Merkel leaves, and he has also decided to leave. So, yeah. So we'll see what happens. Without Merkel and without Löfven, it will be a completely new situation. Now, let's look at Eastern Europe. Why do they take the stand? They are very controversial, as you know. They take a rather similar stand to the issue of immigrants and also to the issue of Muslims in general, from Estonia and down to Romania. If you speak to friends from Poland or Lithuania or Hungary or so on, not to the main politicians, but to normal people or intellectuals, they will say, we were occupied by communism for more than 40 years. And that has effects on our thinking, on our feeling for what is security and what is our identity. So they feel, and they say, you have to respect this. You guys in the Western Europe, where you have had much longer time to, let's say, to digest these multiculturalism and so on. We were in occupation, and now we try to find ourselves and so on. And then we can't afford all of a sudden being invaded by new threats to our religion, because after all, Christianity was our rescuer, and to our national security and to national identity. So therefore, do not let any further foreign religion or ideology into my country. That is then the official policy also of Orban and Kaczynski and others. And that's why these countries did not accept any EU refugee distribution formula when this has been discussed from 2015 and on, and is still discussed and still not solved. So then we have two countries, literally speaking, on the border here, because Austria and Greece, they are, we call them Western European because they were earlier part of the European Union and so on, but they have definitely one foot in Eastern Europe. So the attitudes there are similar to some extent to the Eastern European attitude. We have to be aware, of course, that both the Austrians, and I already mentioned the Greeks, are the Austrians are a little bit more Catholic than the Germans are, Grüß Gott and so on. And the Greeks, of course, are still strong Orthodox. So Prime Minister Kurz, he came out about a year ago, or November 20, and called for real combating political Islam. So he took this expression in his mouth, which other politicians have not done to a large extent, to say political Islam is a threat to the European model of living. Background is, of course, has already been referred to. In 1683, Vienna was besieged by the Ottoman Empire. They survived somehow, they could defend themselves, but it's still there as a trauma. And there was a permanent competition and fight between the influence of the Austrian Empire, which after all was very big, went into half Ukraine, as you may know, and the whole of Balkan, of course, on one hand, and the Ottoman Empire on the other hand. And we still have reminiscences in ex-Yugoslavia, where both Kosovo and Bosnia having, let's say, received their religion from the Ottoman period. Now, and Greece was occupied until the 1820s, when their freedom fight started, and only by 1832 they were really independent again. And they have a high proportion of active Christians, and today they are still the front state, the first state, the land of first arrival of many refugees, both from Middle East and from Afghanistan. So, with all these differences, I've tried to map a little bit what the differences are between the various parts of Europe. The European Union, as so often, wakes up relatively late. But it started, of course, with the 9/11 in 2001 and the European reaction. First, of course, full sympathy for this terrible tragedy for the United States, and then also no doubt that we would participate in the action in Afghanistan. So European troops, members of NATO, and also others like Sweden, would be joining, not only to find Osama bin Laden, but also to somehow fight terrorism. But these were more lip service so far. But in 2005, you have the first attacks you had had in Madrid, you had had in London, and so on. Terrorism started to show its face really also in Europe. And so by then, the European counter-terrorism strategy came, committing the European Union to combating terrorism globally while respecting human rights and allowing its citizens to live in an area of freedom, security and justice. So here is an effort to defend European values of inclusion and at the same time combat terrorism, with particularly, and of course, the political Islam. But it's quite clear that it is difficult to combine these two efforts. By 2015, an agenda was taken, the European Agenda of Security, and then came Charlie Hebdo attack, and then they strengthened it, and the Commission proposed a European Agenda on Security to establish a European Counter-Terrorism Centre, ECTC, which is then in Amsterdam, to improve the exchange of information and the operational support to member states' investigation. It certainly, of course, also there's then coming a cooperation in the so-called Europol, and that has been developing in a few years. So I think the kind of information exchange that they have is helpful against terrorism, at least. In 2017, they reinforced the directive on combating terrorism, criminalizing conduct such as training and traveling for terrorism, as well as terrorist financing. And this also was taken then by most European governments. And in July, the EU Security Union strategy for the period 2020 to 2025 was taken, including preventing and detecting hybrid threats. So this element is now also coming into the to the combating. So the EU counterterrorism agenda was then taken in December 2020. Four main objectives: anticipate, identifying vulnerabilities, building capacity where most needed; prevent, tackling radicalization at all levels; protect, increasing security, denying terrorists the means to act, reinforcing external borders; and respond, minimizing impact, allowing prosecution, increasing support to victims. So slowly but surely, it is an increase in the ambition to combat terrorism, but still without explicitly, except for Kurds and a few others, explicitly speaking about political Islam. And on top of this, as a matter of fact, the day after tomorrow, on 1st of October, a new coordinator for combating terrorism will start his job. It's Ilkka Salmi from Finland. He is recruited from the EU. He has been in security matters, in emergency matters, and so on. He is a lawyer, and he has also been working in Interior Ministry of Helsinki and so on. So it's another step. He will be working for the Secretariat of the Council of the European Union. So for the leading, for the prime ministers, so to say. Now, so to we're coming to the closure here. We have the statements of Macron every now and then, some very strong statements, and we have the statements by Kurz. And we had one motion, as a matter of fact, in the European Parliament, but I would say it was a motion by a representative of Rassemblement National, previous Front National, so which at least takes away a little bit of, let's say, the democratic credibility of the motion. But except for them, so far no explicit official EU reference to political Islam, only to terrorism in general. But many governments have introduced harder punishments, including the German and the Swedish and many others, including some focus on Muslim brothers, on Salafists, and on foreign financing of mosques. So, somehow, after all, say what you want about Professor Huntington, but this idea of a clash of civilizations, which was first presented in 1996, then came a new edition in 2010, it seems somehow we are discussing aspects of that theory, aren't we? And I think it's interesting to compare here with the Cold War. Because at the time, we had a very strong polarization between the West and the East. And it was quite clear that the East system was incompatible with the West system. But they did succeed in establishing a program of peaceful coexistence. Both in Moscow and in Washington, and for that sake also some other Western European governments, they promoted a very strong, they gave a lot of financial resources to such exchange, cultural exchange. You know, jazz orchestras came to Moscow and East Berlin and so on. The Bolshoi Ballet came to New York and Washington. And a lot of lecturers, students, tens of thousands of students visited each other. The critics of that said, particularly the Russian critics, they said that the American students coming here, they are a Trojan horse, because they come here and they start, spreading ideas and so on, which are contagious for the communist soul. That was, but with all these shortcomings and so on, including the defection of Nureyev and others who took the chance when on tour to ask for political asylum, the system of peaceful coexistence somehow functioned, and at least kept the presidents away from this famous button. They didn't press the atomic button, so we didn't have a nuclear war during the Cold War. The Cold War remained cold. But the question is, can this succeed with political Islam and Europe? This is the big issue of today. I leave it with you for perhaps a few minutes discussion before we close. One thing is clear, it's an enormous challenge for cultural diplomacy. Thank you very much.
But this would be probably another conference. Your main issue, especially focusing on the European values versus political Islam. What do you think? Where is our responsibility, the responsibility of the European institutions in promoting those values, which are written in the European Charter, Fundamental Charter rights? Where is our responsibility, not only for the migration community, but also for our European societies?
Well, I think this challenge would have been much easier, of course, 40 years ago. But forget for a minute that 40 years ago was when this all started, about the renaissance of religion. Look at just the size of the European Union. If you take, if you have a European Union, or as it was at the time, European, EEC, the common values of this founding group of Europeans, France, Germany, Benelux, and Italy, perhaps then one or two other countries joining. It was easier to find a common denominator, and this means also the time lap between a decision and the action was shorter. When we are 15, it already becomes a little bit difficult. This happened in 1995. When we are then 28, and this is 2013, it is much more difficult. And of course, from my presentation, you will understand that, of course, the crucial thing is that a new group of countries come. To give another example, when the Iraq War started in March 2003, it was preceded by efforts from George W. Bush to have France and Germany and the whole of Europe joining him in this attack against Iraq. But France immediately said no, more or less by tradition. Germany, to the great disappointment of Bush, Gerhard Schröder also said no. But the Eastern European countries, who they had become members of NATO in 1999, and they became members of the European Union in 2004, 1 year later. For them, it was very clear: we have to join. We are now benefiting from the umbrella, the strategic umbrella of the United States. So that is more important than whatever Schröder or Chirac are saying in Berlin and Paris. So that was then what Defense Minister Rumsfeld said. The new Europeans, they are the good Europeans because they know what is important here in the world. The old Europeans, and that was these, the founding members and some more. They did not understand the point. And I think if we are to on your question, it is the same kind of problem. That if we didn't know it before, we knew by 2003, we knew that here is a difficult difference in basic views on the world outside Europe, including how to deal with Iraq, including how to deal with political Islam. You're absolutely right, and that is a disaster, quite frankly. And that is the main reason for the problems that we are facing in Sweden, for instance, to some extent in Germany. I have represented Sweden for such a long time, so I hate to criticize my own country. But we somehow, even the Prime Minister had confessed, we were perhaps a little bit blue-eyed. We were perhaps naive. We didn't see it coming, and so on. All these kind of statements. Sweden is a champion in development assistance. And always wants to be a little bit of a moral conscience of the world. And we think that means also we should not only help there, we should also have open doors and open hearts for people coming here. And that's good. Okay, fine. But the interpretation of these open doors was then also that, well, they should go on speaking their own languages. They should be taught on the expense of the Swedish state, be taught in the school their own language, rather than a strong focus on learning Swedish. And that is, absolutely essential, that the newcomers and, of course, their kids are learning the language. And if you then come from a culture where the women tend to stay back home and also don't follow the language courses in Swedish and so on, well, you are starting to build up a society of ghettos, of parallel societies, and so on. So the integration has been discovered, I would say, only in the last 10 years, really, and particularly in the last 5 years. It's absolutely necessary that the small kids of people arriving, that they go into a kindergarten. I asked a provocative question earlier, assimilation. That is not necessary, but a good integration where they really understand what the receiving country's culture is all about, the values. particularly, I would say, the gender equality. I think that is particularly crucial, because if you have a completely different way of kind of macho thinking, or the wife should be back home in the kitchen and have as many kids as possible, and so that is not a way to get integrated in a Western European society. So you're absolutely right. No, I don't see that. There is hardly, there wouldn't be any statistic proving that tendency, and I also don't know any, because after all I have children and their friends and so on. I don't see any tendency of that. The secular, the rather, let's say, agnostic or whatever you wish to call it, or don't care kind of attitude remains, and so it's a difference. You know, the only strongly religious countries in the Western world is, of course, United States. But you could never, and every president, whatever color, would always say, end his speech with "God bless America." That's necessary. It's in the protocol. I don't think a Swedish prime minister or even king has said that in the last 100 years, and they won't do that in the coming 100 years either, as far as I can see. No, it's a very gloomy picture, and I think I didn't give a very optimistic view at the end. It's an enormous challenge, but a challenge is sometimes an understatement for an impossible task. So it is rather gloomy, I agree. But there's one thing that I think Europeans have forgotten. I had the pleasure of co-founding this European Culture Parliament almost 20 years ago, and at that time, early the 00s, there was a kind of so-called EU-phoria. Everybody was enthusiastic. Everybody is now kind of buying the European values. Even the East Europeans are now joining. And so on. And it's the possibilities of the European values spreading even further west. You know, I often go to Georgia, for instance, and Ukraine. And you know, if you are one day very skeptical about Europe and European cooperation and so on, and think that's nothing more, then you should go to Tbilisi or to Kiev, and you will hear Euro enthusiasm. Because that is the dream for them. That is how life should be. And it's not only about money. It's also about freedom of speech, about gender equality, etc., etc., etc. So if we don't believe in the European project somehow, at least we should go to those who hope to become parts of it. Oh, Kosovo also, by the way, or even Serbia, and so on. They are hoping also because they think life will be better together with the other Europeans in a European Union. So there are these visions. They were very strong 100 years ago. Then came the differences with the Iraq War. Then came the financial crisis. Then came the differences with the Ukrainian war. And then came Brexit, and then came COVID-19, and you know, there's so many challenges. And today, of course, the popularity of the European Union as such is not so strong. But there's one thing we should always remind Europeans about: Europe has the best lifestyle in the world. And there is something there's something attractive in that, and we should be prepared to defend this lifestyle and say this is good, including all the things about gender equality, about tolerance, etc. And if we believe in ourselves, after all, we are not so few. We are some 500, 600 million people, and if we all were together believing that, that would perhaps be a kind of a weapon against political Islam. But that's the only hope I can see. On the first question, and remind me if I forget the second one, but the second is also important. On the first question, I think, as I see it, it has to do with this German oversensitivity about having official opinions on other races, religions, cultures, and everything has to do with the Nazi time. And because of that, they are very careful, and less than the Dutch or the Belgians, and of course of the France. So that's why they don't seem to be prepared to take such a. I don't know if would you have an idea on that particular one? Why Germany does not have anything similar, or somebody else?
At first, I would doubt that the Austrian law is. What do you mean? I don't see any.
They had done in Austria. They had done really a law. They had done really a good control on Muslim brotherhoods, on their finance supports, and on their behavior on the society.
This is
very important.
This is one aspect I already mentioned in my presentation, that it is essential to fight movement like political Islam through, for example, its finances. This is now a new recent directive in the Austrian Parliament, which is looking into such a topic, but it's still not a law.
It's exactly not a law, but I think they published something like this.
That's the point. So follow the money. That is a kind of a rule which probably is relevant also here. And the Germans were very good at following the tax evaders of Germany about 10 years ago, and they really all the money which was placed in secret accounts in Switzerland and so on. But they should have an agenda of this type. I agree with you. But may I then go to the next question, which was about Merkel and so on. Angela Merkel became well-known and popular and respected all over the world, particularly because of her small steps. One step ahead, and then perhaps wait some months, and then another step, and so on. About a lange Atem, so the Germans say, a long breath and thinking about it. But she had three exceptions, and you could write, probably books will be written about that. One was she very quickly took a decision of abolishing nuclear power after the Fukushima accident in 2011. And many people say that this was perhaps not such a wise decision, but it was quick. And the second one was Wir schaffen das in 2015. And it was from a humanitarian point of view, and also from if you looked at the pictures from the Budapest train station and the borders of Serbia and Croatia, etc., perhaps the only one. But you are right in saying wir schaffen das nicht.
Sorry,
yeah.
to interrupt you. I said this in 2015.
Yeah.
I was in a meeting also in German Foreign Ministry and in Iraq department, and I told them I think probably she's not able to manage.
Yeah, because of course it's evident when all of a sudden so many people, almost 1 million people came, and to little Sweden, came 180,000 people, and of course the problem is that I always like to compare this, for instance, refugee situation in Lebanon or in Uganda. Uganda has taken 3 million, or more or less overnight from South Sudan and Central African Republic, etc., because they don't have a particular policy, and they don't have authorities who have to register each single person and take the responsibility for their housing, for their schooling, for their health care, for their jobs, etc. They say just go there. You might find a place, put up a tent, and you may be okay. And the rest, the UNHCR and the World Food Programme takes care of the rest. So. Germany and Sweden are not like that. We are, some people say, over-bureaucratized countries, but this is for the citizens. They are good-meaning, well-meaning governments who wants every citizen somehow to have a chance. And all of a sudden you have 1 million extra, and you don't have the bureaucratic apparatus for that, and that is evident. So it took a very long time to deal with this. The small steps forward should have been applied there as well. That's what I think. But of course, it was a difficult situation and difficult decision.
And one of the recommendations that I want to add also to the end of this conference also, to focus our efforts and on our topic and write to the new German parliament, because really you are waiting new rules or new law. I hope that we can achieve it. This is one of the recommendations that I want really to
Thank you.
share with you.
This is your message, and shall we, do you want to formulate it more exactly?
Exactly. I want to formulate it exactly.
Now, here and now?
Or later we can write it and we can send to the new German parliament.
Yeah.
To the last one we sent, but we did not get any feedback.
Okay. Well, that is problem in today, that very often very good things do not get the feedback they deserve. So, but anyway, I take the chance to thank you for the initiative that we are all here, and we are already have gone far beyond the time. But anyway, it's been a pleasure to be here, and thank you so much. And thank you very much. Okay, thank you.
I have a question, a quick question. What do you think, for example, the European Parliament or European decision makers or government, lately they put Hezbollah on that terrorist list as terrorist. What do you think, why that prevent or stop them from doing that the same with Muslim Brotherhood, whereas like we read a lot about their implication or involvement in a lot of terrorist attack or actions. What do you think, why you think that still there is no action toward that?
Now, it's hard to tell. I think it may have to do with the fact that some people claim that the Muslim Brotherhood is not explicit a terrorist organization because they are not committing terrorist crimes. They seem to be the brain behind, or somehow the soul behind. And that has been perhaps so far too sophisticated for European politicians to understand.
Yeah, but as long as you said, there seems to be like the brain behind that. So the brain should be condemned. I guess it's more than that.
That's true. But as a matter of fact, first of all, the European Union is 27 countries with very different orientations. We call it diversity, unity in diversity. And this makes sometimes difficult decisions particularly difficult to have everybody in agreement. And there is a built-in sensitivity in Brussels and among many political leaders to grab something which is more ideological, because they tend to feel that religion and ideology is more something which should be free. Everybody should be allowed to have these activities as long as they abide by the laws and don't commit crimes like terrorist crimes. Then we don't touch them. I think very slowly the European politicians might now be discovering that there are such brains behind, and that is important to somehow counteract against that. But it takes time, it seems.
Muslim Brotherhood, they are just like representing themselves or they are like presenting themselves as they are representing the Islam, which is somehow, it's kind of monopoly to the Islam. So the question is, what do you think the actions, or also even the government, has to take to not allow them to not allow the Muslim Brotherhood to exclude other Muslims, even Sunni, Shia, same sect. So what do you think, how they have to take kind of action to encourage the other Muslims, liberal Muslims, to talk and dialogue?
Yeah, European governments and the European Union can of course only take decisions and actions within Europe. I wouldn't. Okay. We participated in Afghanistan. We are participating also with soldiers in Mali and other places, and so on, to fight terrorism or the headquarters of terrorism. But when it comes to this, the interpretation of Islam, I think this goes so far beyond the political mandate, and that is a problem. But it's only when we can see very clear. I think many Europeans are starting to realize, when they have seen how Erdogan, for instance, have been abusing his power in terms of freedom of press, freedom of opinion, etc., that we come perhaps one step closer to also openly saying, but as others have said, it's important that the European Muslims, after all, there are how many? 40 million or so in Europe, that they are encouraged to stand up for liberal Islam.
And dialogue.
And then we can have a dialogue, of course, but that is because otherwise there's a risk, if they don't stand up, that you are more or less accusing all Muslims for things which only 1 or 2% are guilty of, and that is the big challenge.
Just because to not be accused, don't you think that here kind of responsibility also for the governments to encourage the, let us say, the sleeping liberal Muslims to talk, to open dialogue?
Absolutely. You're right. That has probably been done too little. You're absolutely right in that. But it's again, the European governments, including Swedish and German and so on, they always have the feeling, we have to go very carefully and we don't take too strong steps, and so on. So that's the reason why they haven't really said it openly and clearly to the communities. Please stand up and defend your religion and condemn those abusing it.
Thank you.